Hello and welcome. I usually like short intros. This is not one, and you will soon hear why. Erica Edwards received her PhD at Duke from the literature program, had to start with that, and taught at UC Riverside and Rutgers before her current position at Yale, where she is Lillian Shavinson Sadin Professor of English and Black Studies and Chair of Black Studies. While at Riverside, she founded the Lyndon Barrett Scholars Mentoring Program and co-founded with Grace Kyung-Wong Hong the University of California Consortium for Black Studies. She is the author of Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership from University of Minnesota Press, which won the 2012 Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Prize for an outstanding scholarly study of Black American literature and culture, the first of many prizes, and the other book, The Other Side of Terror, Black Women and the Culture of U.S. Empire from NYU Press, which was the 2022 winner of the American Studies Association's John Hope Franklin Prize for Most Outstanding Book in American Studies, honorable mention for both the Modern Language Association's James Russell Lowell Prize for Outstanding Book and the Gloria E. Anzaldúa Prize from the National Women's Studies Association. It was also a finalist for both the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Book Prize and the Prose Award in Literature from the Association of American Publishers, and shortlisted for the Charles H. Stone Book Award for exceptional literary adult nonfiction focusing on African American history and culture. So you see what I mean. She is the co-editor, along with Roderick Ferguson and Jeffrey Ogbar, of Keywords for African American Studies at NYU Press, and her publications have appeared in such journals as Differences, Callaloo, American Quarterly, American Literary History, and Black Camera, and in public-facing venues like the Los Angeles Review of Books and the Washington Post. And that's just some of it. Professor Edwards' work considers the often fraught relationships among Black feminism, Black literary and cultural production, and national and international politics. Confronting head-on the complexities of politics, she does not shy away from difficult questions arising from the centrality of Blackness, and especially Black women and Black feminism, to the national imaginary. In Charisma, for example, she offers what she calls a new cultural history of the fictions of political leadership in contemporary African American culture. Turning to both history and fiction, she shows how the figure of the Black male charismatic leader is at once appropriated and appropriative, with the result of obscuring and disabling what she calls the hope of a more radical collectivity and the urgency of the creative complaint. As she also demonstrates, however, that hope lives in the works of fiction that astutely disrupt as they manifest the national and nationalist, race and gendered strategies of appropriation. Professor Edwards builds on this work in The Other Side of Terror, where she shows how Black feminist writers expose the processes through which Blackness is foundational to U.S. forms of the discourse, or, to use her more precise terms, grammar, of counter-terror in service of U.S. imperialism. As in Charisma, she is exquisitely attentive to the nuances of power and political movements. While Black radicalism in the 1960s became central to definitions of terror as an idea and in the person of individuals, think Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell, it could also be subsequently assimilated as emblematic of U.S. post-racial and post-racist multicultural enlightenment. The Other Side of Terror features Black feminist writers' exposures of what Professor Edwards calls African American literature's troubling embeddedness in public languages of security and their consequent ability to call forth new languages, new practices, and new imaginaries of survival and safety. At the same time, she is committed to complexity and nuance, to taking a hard look even at the terms of resistance. As she puts it, her goal is not to present us with a bipartite cast of bad subjects who are seduced by U.S. empire and good subjects who resist it. It is instead to clarify the troubled intimacy between any notion of Black women and imperial culture, and to draw this clarification in the trenchant terms of Black feminist organizing and literature, movements that had their own troubled intimacy. These books are real gifts to us all, exempla of the important insights works of literature as well as Black feminism can offer into the Scylla and Charybdis of U.S. politics in relation to the grammar of counterterrorism, imperialism, and racism. They exemplify as well what meticulous scholarly work looks like and what it can do. Please join me in welcoming Erica Edwards.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you all so much. It's so meaningful and already so nourishing to be here in community with you all in this conserved space, as Robin said in that beautiful documentary. Thank you to the students for the documentary, for helping us enter this space with a clear understanding of how much work has gone into creating and sustaining it. It's really meaningful. Thank you, Jennifer Nash, for being such an incredible organizer and the convener we need for this moment. Thank you to Kayla McManus Vienna and all of the staff and faculty in Duke GSF for hosting us and making sure that we got here safely. Thank you to Lauren Henschel and Jaman and the tech team in the back. That wasn't easy, but I think we will get there. And thank you to Priscilla Wald for that very generous and quite comprehensive introduction. Just a couple of accessibility notes. One, are my slides good to go, Jaman? Are we good? Okay, thank you. Couple of accessibility notes. I am not going to give text descriptions of my images. I'm sorry, just in the interest of time, I can't do that. But if you are on the Zoom room, you can pull up my Google Slides and the alt text is available there. I also have a few accessibility copies of my talk on that table in the back left corner of the room. And I think I'm all set. Oh, thank you. I'm like, something happened. Please. Yes, okay, so this is my talk. It's called Sheathed in It, Notes on Texture and Recovery. It's in 4 parts. Part 1 is called Sheathed in It. So my approach to feminist theory is informed by the late, great Barbara Christian, who let it be known that her method, a word she placed in quotation marks, was to learn from the language of creative writers. A language of surprise, she noted, suggesting that the capacity for surprise that literature helps us cultivate is itself a kind of intelligence. Christian called this intelligence a tuned sensitivity to that which is alive, and therefore cannot be known until it is known. Attuned sensitivity is what I think the disasters we are surviving, the emergencies of the present, call for. And I think it is appropriate to think of this sensitivity as having emerged from Black queer feminism's interest in reorganizing the senses. As LaMonda Horton Stallings suggests, what Black queer and trans feminisms offer us is an invitation to, quote, read as well as feel, hear as much as see, touch and taste, and foresee as well as see. Along these lines of sensitivity and sensory reorganization, what I want to think about with you today are the textures of recovery in contemporary culture, following a line of thinking that my own creative work has prompted, and that the Black women and non-binary writers I teach provoke even more deeply and more skillfully. It's a line of thinking that I started following the last time I taught my 21st century Black aesthetics class. And we were wrapping up our study of Rivers Solomon's first novel. It's called An Unkindness of Ghosts. And published in 2017, the novel takes place 300 years in the future on a large ship that has been orbiting aimlessly since leaving the Earth. It features a Black neurodivergent, genderqueer protagonist, Aster, who lives among the Black dispossessed, known as the Tarlanders, in the lower decks of the ship, and who nurtures a meaningful relationship to plants as a healer. She works alongside the other Tarlanders as a sharecropper, but she also uses plants, which she nurtures in a special place called a botanarium, to heal the other Tarlanders. Aster was left on the ship by her mother, who she believes committed suicide. And her best friend, Giselle, is also neurodivergent, surviving with depression, and often using self-harm to cope. It was the final book of the novel we were discussing that day in class. And in that part of the novel, Giselle, the best friend, burns down the protagonist's botanarium. And the narrator gets close, letting us, the reader, into Giselle's mind as she lays torch to every possibility of healing and repair in the midst of a white supremacy so enduring, so it's self-suicidal that it can turn a spaceship into a slave ship and plantation and keep it like that, circling and circling with nowhere to go for 300 years. Giselle explains her choice to burn it down this way. She's glass. Nope, sorry, I gotta go back. That's not the right one. Sorry. She's glass. I'm glass. We're all glass, busted up, unrecognizable from our original selves. We walk around in fragments. It's a circus act. For the act of arson, which actualizes and actually mirrors this shattering of the subject, and in so doing lays waste to all of the glass bottles and journals, Giselle is punished with execution at the gallows at a place called the Clearing, where there is no baby Suggs and there is no love for no flesh. Meanwhile, Aster is dealing with the loss of her botanarium. All that was left of a person's life was recorded on paper, in annals, in almanacs, in the physical items they produced. To end that was to end their history, their present, their future. That's what the narrator says. There be no forgiveness this time. So there is no cure, no reparation, no forgiveness, no future, no best thing. There is only loss. Black does crack. And all that is restored, and maybe restored isn't even the right word, maybe held is better, is this brittleness. On the gallows platform, Giselle will not go down easy. She renames herself Devil, flouting the hyper-religious administration, what Amy Laura Hall in her illuminating new book calls muscular Christianity. Aster unsheaths her knife and tosses it to her friend on the gallows platform. And for a moment, we think we will win. But no, Aster, quote, knew that the world in which Giselle slew every one of these men did not exist, that one half-crazed woman could only do so much. Instead, Giselle stabs herself in the stomach. Her last words, I will haunt you, cue the unkindness of ghosts. The dead do not offer victory or reconciliation. The dead offer nothing but what they are. Circus acts, fragments, brittling remains. Okay, so we are still in book 4 of An Unkindness of Ghosts, where now after the depressive femme's self-execution, a rebellion breaks out and there is war. And I am reminded of a point Orasami Burton makes about war when he writes of the 1971 Attica Rebellion. The war in Attica prison, he says, was only the hard outer layer. The inner core of the rebellion was constituted by radically new forms of human sociality and care. By destroying existing relations of psychological, social, and spatial domination, the rebellion unlocked new channels of inner mutation, metamorphosis, and self-actualization, new subjects who elaborated themselves as they inhabited, explored, and enjoyed their illegal freedom. In a Fanonian understanding of violence, violence works from the exterior to the interior, birthing new subjects. In a miracle of miracles, men birth new men. That's not what happens here. And this, the holding off of rebirth, situates an unkindness of ghosts alongside other Black queer speculative texts, which, as Tariq Pickens reminds us, refuse a linear progressive view of history and ask us to work with the mutual constitution of Blackness and disability rather than remain stagnated between recuperation and resistance. During the rebellion, Solomon's protagonist, Aster, escapes to a shuttle that her mother, a mechanic, had died trying to repair, a fact Aster deduces by riding the wave of rioters to the shuttle and finding inside her mother's bones. And Aster escapes. She ejects herself from the slave ship spaceship and returns to Earth. The Earth has now regenerated itself. It's been 300 years, and this new beginning is where the story ends. The novel ends, and this is really all I wanted to talk about. Thank you. The novel ends with sensory soothing, an abundance of touches, and a catalog of soft things, all of which cushion what remain a hard landing. Aster touches her mother's bones. She, quote, drew a finger along the chin, the broken teeth. Then she roved her fingers over the soft stitches of an ivory blanket that she finds in a basket beside her dead mother. Bone and its soft surrounding things are all that is left of the mother. Her mother's, quote, clothes were intact, a dark green jacket, very soft, and leggings made of hide. Aster presses the blanket to her cheek, and there is, with these bones, these brittle bones cradled by soft things, and next to them the bloody Giselle, laying to rest in black dirt. And this is a long passage. I'm just going to read like maybe the second part. Aster carried her mother's bones in the basket outside and set them on the ground. She got on her hands and knees and dug. She placed her mother inside first, covering her with the blanket. It was harder, much harder, to lay Giselle to join her. And though Aster's muscles hurt, she held her in her arms for many minutes, kissing her cheek and nuzzling her face into Giselle's hair. She felt sentimental. She felt superstitious. She felt like she could cry and catch her tears in a magic vial, pour the tears over Giselle's face and resurrect her. But Aster was too dehydrated to weep, and even if she weren't, the water would do nothing but wet Giselle's dead, indifferent face, then evaporate. Repositioning Giselle's fingers so they were interlaced with her own, Aster rested beside her. Water was not good for such times as this, insubstantial as it was, but dirt. Dirt would do. They were sheathed in it. Okay, and here, thank you again for bearing with me, is where our discussion in class faltered that day. That's it? The students pleaded. That's how it ends. They wanted more for Giselle. Giselle deserved more. And they wanted a future for Aster and for us. And I pleaded back, well, what if that is it? What if where we end is not with a Black queer hero doing more reproductive work for us? What if what has the last say is what is soft, what is receptive, what is negative, what folds over and folds in? Can we see this soft compression that the novel leaves us with, not as a victory, but as like something, something substantial? I think how I put it is like, at least they're not fucking with her anymore. And that's where we ended. So sheathed in it. These are the novel's last words. The sheathing that happens at the end of the novel, a sheathing in which the dirt acts as cover and insulation for the bodies that have become sharp and brittle, and in which the dirt becomes a living tissue or sheath, which envelops another living tissue, offers up a kind of materiality to work with at the end of the world. like the compression therapy, sometimes called deep pressure therapy, that is used to reduce anxiety and sensory overstimulation for neurodivergent people. The sheathing here grounds Aster, except literally Aster enlists every soft thing available to attune to this reality. The end really is the end. The last page is actually where the world ends. So continuing the line of inquiry that we opened up that day, what I want to offer today are notes from a larger project about sensory processing and texture. And what I want to suggest is that softness in contemporary culture compensates for and or aids us in coping with and or props up collaborations with what I think we can call retaliatory patriarchy. But at the same time, softness serves the recalibration of sensory processing or recovery at the end of the world. And when I say at the end of the world, I mean at the end of the end of the world, like at the end of the last 500 years. Okay. All right. So part two, they're coming for our interiors. The first thing they did was send Black women home. Just like in Paradise, shooting the first woman clarified it like butter. The pure oil of hatred on top, its hardness stabilized below. The escalated phase of the Trumpist fascist order began with the expulsion of Black women from public sector jobs. This expulsion was the clearing ground for the continued investment in carceral infrastructure and the transfer of $85 billion in ICE enforcement and detention. Between February and July 2025, Black women lost 319,000 jobs in an economy in which they were overrepresented in the public sector. When Trump took office, Black women made up 12% of the federal workforce, nearly double their share in the labor force overall in the public sphere. This signaled a decisive end to the incorporative mode of power. Black women, as Hortense Spillers taught us, have been plundered as resources in the national treasury of rhetorical wealth. And public narratives of Black women as emasculating mothers and welfare queens provided cover for the upward transfers of wealth over the past 6 decades. And as we also know, the significations of Black women as successful and agential, as empowered leaders on the global stage, was one of the main features of liberal multiculturalism between the 1970s and the early aughts. After the global insurgency of the late 1960s, members of the liberal conservative intellectual elite posited that the excess of democracy that social movements had unleashed had dampened U.S. public approval for defense and had led to demands of spending on public services, demands that were caricatured by narratives of deviant Black women. The answer to this excess of democracy was the incorporation of Black people into various sectors of public life, including police forces and welfare agencies. When the mode of power in the wake of the 1960s interruption of the global capitalist system was not to discipline and punish, but to represent and affirm, when the mode of power was the incorporation of minority difference, Black women brought their expertise to the jobs that had been hard won by civil rights struggles and, at the same time, bolstered the image of the U.S. as the world leader in multiracial democracy. 2025's mass firings, taking place as they did under the banner of anti-diversity, anti-woke house cleaning, and in the name of efficiency, were the exclamation point on the denouement of neoliberal multiculturalism that began more than a decade ago. The fascist turn was a retaliation for the meager wins of civil rights and a refusal of power's incorporative mode, a mode whose limits we already understood quite well. It was and continues to be an assault on a multi-generational struggle for economic civil rights, which was about not only access to jobs, but access to work that would at least nominally, at least sometimes, offset the worst vagaries of late capitalism. Black women were central to the struggle over the right to public employment at both the state and federal levels. For example, both the National Alliance and the Negro American Labor Council, two of 9 unions representing postal workers in the 1960s, lobbied for the passage of the 1961 Executive Order 10925, which banned discrimination in federal employment and contracting. By the 1960s, postal work was a major industry for Black women. In 66, the Union Mail, the monthly newspaper of the militant industrial Manhattan Bronx Postal Union, noted that Black women were comprising the largest portion of women coming into the post office, fleeing the treatment they had received in domestic service. In his study of federal workers in DC, Frederick Gooding Jr. traces the role of federal work in the making of the Black middle class in DC, noting, quote, while DC had no manufacturing industries that attracted Blacks during the Great Migrations from 1915 to the 1950s, Black newcomers did find jobs in DC's burgeoning public sector. While smaller in absolute size, DC had a higher proportion of Blacks than metropolises such as New York, Detroit, or Philadelphia during the post-war era. By 1950, Black people comprised a third of the population in Washington and would reach a majority in over 70% just 2 decades later. When Dr. Peggy Carr was fired from her 35-year career as the head statistician for the Federal Department of Education, she told the New York Times, "It was like being prosecuted in front of my family, my work family. It was like I was being taken out like the trash. The only difference is I was being taken out the front door rather than the back door." To be sent home was to be made to feel prosecuted, not persecuted in the general sense, but prosecuted in the specific way that Blackness is relegated, disposable, and invisible under the carceral domain of public and private life. While Carr's perfectly ordered domestic space might be configured differently than those of working class Black women who were fired from other federal jobs or from their equivalent in state and city governments, that Carr expressed her firing as a policing reminds us that Black women were sent home from the public sector back to interiors that had already been pathologized, surveilled, and could be invaded at any moment. As we take up Shaniqua Roach's call to, quote, rethink Black domestic life, not as a site of pathology, but as material, spatial, psychic, and erotic ground rife with luscious possibility, we also want to attend to how, by the time Carr got home, the domestic sphere had already been rendered carceral, so thoroughly ravaged by the demolition of civil rights dreams, held not just by Carr, but we might imagine, by whoever is back there, blurred in the photograph behind her. What did Peggy Carr do when she was sent home? Witness the outrageously hued paisley print blazer, the sculpture made of something like wavy grasses or rope, the carefully tended plants, the gently bumped wig. Did these soft things cushion the blow? Did the soft edges of Peggy Carr's domestic arts soften how it must have felt to have all of the expertise she honed over 3 decades as a statistician carted out the front door like trash? The first thing they did was send Black women home, but it wasn't the last thing. Retaliatory patriarchy, of course, rests on the assumption that left protest issues from a wrinkle in the gender form. Cancel culture is for pussies, right? So they never forgave you for 2017 when you marched your fuzzy pussy hats into the streets, or for 2020 when you canceled everybody. They called for real men to rid us of all of that public femaleness and put it all back where it belonged. And the culture of women back where they belong is ascendant. The trad wife subculture is one easy example, right? The trad wife turns toward turns toward the interior, taking over and investing pleasure in all of those housework tasks that piled onto working parents, especially working women during COVID. MAGA masculinity on the streets and over the walls called forth an interior corollary to hold and process public anxieties, gendered anxieties about health, work, personal survivability, economic survivability, white survivability, and even in leftier, less MAGAfied spaces, the same pleasure wage circulates, often surfacing not as sincerity or morality, but as kink or play. So consider Ari Lennox's Soft Girl Era, a song in which she pleads to a potential lover, hurry up and put me in my soft girl era. I'll just play a few minutes of it.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Y'all know what this is. Baby, that's $1 million in the mirror. Yeah. Step back, get back, and get nearer. Tryna do nothing but look pretty in here. Yeah. Hurry up and put me in my soft girl era. Take first class, I ain't going nowhere. Nails there, rent face, take me somewhere. Tryna do nothing but look pretty in here. Hurry up and put me in my soft girl era.
Okay. In Lennox's music video, a company of soft girls inside is made legible by the soft objects abutting their flesh. Fur boots, fur pumps, shag rug, furry pink bench, voluminous curtains, flowing wigs, polyester tutus, satin shorts, silk bonnets, all awash in the softest of lights. It's a hard knock life. Can you treat me right? Show me something new. So the soft girl trend that the video is indexing rewards, I think, a healthy understanding of parody. But I think at least some of us spend enough time scrolling to notice that all around us, we are re-educating our senses to accept, or at least to cushion the brutalities of the fascist gender form, or maybe it's just my algorithm. The brutal expulsion from the public, to return to my larger point about retaliatory patriarchy, overlaid, we might say, the masculinization of Black women and Black women's resistance. It followed a process of discipline and the punishment that American public, political, prison, and visual cultures initiated after 1968 to banish the threat of Black radicalism and especially radical Black feminism, and to pummel the appearance of Black revolutionary women into an understanding of Black women that enabled the reproduction of a properly heterosexual sociality, as Kara Keeling argues in her indispensable The Witch's Flight. As I've argued elsewhere, it was in the realm of culture, especially in mainstream cinema, in the repeated adaptation of Black feminist literature for anti-feminist film, that we saw over and over again a formula for celebrating the achievements of Black women in activism while funneling those celebrations into privatized cycles of consumption and celebrity. The mainstreaming of Black women's empowerment, conceived of as a kind of racial pride mixed with individual success in the privatized arenas of the home and the corporation, remade Black women's interiors into places where Black women, always already monstrous, could theoretically achieve proper gender. We could think of the combination of efficiency and violence that culminated in the mass expulsion of Black women from the public sphere as one move in a larger campaign of organized abandonment that was not just a political economic assault, but also a multi-generational assault on the body and its senses. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore argues, the rise of the anti-state state, what she calls organized abandonment, undergirded by new right laissez-faireism, unleashed the techniques of coercion and punishment honed on disposable populations to the population at large. So crisis becomes generalized when abandonment is organized and rationalized, when the state delegitimates and dismantles its welfare capacities and, quote, reallocates racial capitalism's accumulation crisis by taking resources from institutions, programs, streets, households, and lives. Brenda Bondar and Alberto Toscano explain in their introduction to Ruthie Gilmore's Abolition Geography, the workfare warfare state shifted from a pendulum economy of rights in which the state would extend legal recognition and basic norms of equality during good times and then contract them during bad times to a generalized punitive and carceral logic. That's what we're living through now, right? In this context, race and gender continue to organize the abandonment, a permanent state of belligerence, but in ways that are capricious and unpredictable. Bondar and Toscano usefully point out that our participation in the naturalization of domination is rewarded by non-economic wages. We need to attend to the fact, they say, that the anti-state state could become an object of popular attachment, or better, populist investment, only through the mediation of race. Perhaps one of our most urgent tasks then is to explain these attachments to and investments in the anti-state state and the gender forms that give them shape. Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm like, now it's 3, the objects of a new mode of inquiry. So then what precisely are those non-economic wages that we accept for generalized punishment? What is the pleasure wage? And where in our bodies is the pleasure wage directly deposited? Answering these questions brings us back to the work of culture, asking us to reckon with culture as a sense-making apparatus, as a collection of practices and encoded meanings that bundle common sense, meaning in the Gramscian sense, ideology, meaning following Juanita Lubiano, a narrative of political history or a system of belief about what is good and true and beautiful, with an ongoing education of the senses. As Sylvia Wynter suggests, the brain is wired for the sensory training that culture offers through, for example, the disciplines that make sense of it, such as literary and film studies, or, for example, through texts themselves. In her well-known essay, Rethinking Aesthetics, Wynter calls for a new science of human forms of life, a deciphering practice that might bring to cultural interpretation an empirical or data-driven account of how meaning-making in the realm of culture functions as pure or functions as a pure behavior regulating system, signaling systems that are complementary to and regulating of the signaling systems and internal regulating systems of the brain. She's working through a theory following the social biologist James Danieli that we behave according to the dictates of a given cultural imaginary or social program, as Danieli had it, because, quote, the activation of the internal reward system releases substances, actual opioid peptides, in appropriate centers of the brain, which produce some degree of euphoria. Orders of discourse, Wynter suggests, code the internal reward system of the brain, not only normalizing, but also anesthetizing domination by attaching biological rewards to meanings of life-worthiness and death-worthiness, or good and evil. In this system of coding and rewarding, discourses of aesthetic judgment that live in literary studies universalize what are actually culture-specific meanings, such as aesthetic judgment. So taste is accorded to, quote, those humans who are sufficiently genetically evolved so as to be occupied with thoughts as well as their senses, which is contrasted to the taste of the non-middle classes as the expression of the evolutionary backward taste of men wholly absorbed by their senses. So when Wynter calls for a practice of deciphering that will, quote, take the image, sound, signifying practices of film as the objects of a new mode of inquiry, I think she's calling for a post-aesthetic, even post-critique mode of reading that works from, or at least with, sensory absorption to retrain the internal reward system, or at least understand this internal reward system better. Following Winter and her new science, we can say that culture follows and rationalizes and collaborates with brute force to produce the sensorium, that culture structures the internal reward system and teaches us how pleasurable it feels when we get power right. These rewards, of course, are unequally dispersed. Consider the case that Mark Smith makes in How Race is Made, that the sensory stereotypes that white people advanced during slavery, that Black people smelled bad, for example, or had tough skin that was resistant to pain, relieved white people of the cognitive load of thinking about race. Especially when visual markers of race became less reliable because of miscegenation, the production of an anti-Black white sensorium, a sensorium that valued quiet, valued odorlessness, valued softness, relieved most white Southerners of this discomfort of thinking, levied no tax on the mind. The education of white senses displaced the cognitive load of race thinking onto Black people, who would now have to bear the labor and the risk not only of thinking about how race worked, but actually performing sensory respectability, for example, by washing with toxic chemicals to smell clean amid the harsh labor conditions that unequally distributed sweat and thereby what is understood as odor in the first place. The world building and meaning making work of slavery in North America also recruited everything from the tools of torture to the weather to reproduce a racial sensorium that rewarded soft whiteness and hard Blackness. Enslavers weaponized cold weather, for example, in ways that minimized their own exertion and preserved the softness of their own skin, displacing the direct enactment of violence onto the hostile environment and exerting far less energy in doing so than would be required, for instance, in meting out 100 lashes. But the enslaved made do with what softness they could scrape together, using animal skins and furs to supplement shoe allotments, for example, or hunting when snow was on the ground because it was easier to follow animal tracks in the impressionable ground. If the racial sensorium rewards white understimulation and Black overstimulation, Black recovery is sensory and sense-making work. Du Bois went so far as to suggest that Black people had a special sensory dispensation. The Negro is primarily an artist. The usual way of putting this is to speak disdainfully of his sensuous nature. This means that the only race which has held at bay the life-destroying forces of the tropics has gained therefrom in some slight compensation a sense of beauty, particularly for sound and color. So the Negro is primarily an artist, he said, and not because Black people are capable only of emotion but not thought, but because they compose, quote, the only race which has held at bay the life-destroying forces of the tropics. Perhaps it is constant exposure to trauma, what the public health researcher Arlene T. Geronimus calls weathering, that lends to Black life its sensitivity, its drive for sensory input, its magnetism to color and sound, to rhythm and texture. I'm thinking of Setha in Beloved, thinking about what her mother had endured and how Baby Suggs's recovery from the trauma of enslavement was sensory work. Now I know why Baby Suggs pondered color in her last years. Morrison writes, she never had time to see, let alone enjoy it before. Took her a long time to finish with blue, then yellow, then green. She was well into pink when she died. Black people, having survived transplanting from the tropics, having survived the whip and the bit, the battle, the lynching tree, both unimaginable overstimulation and enforced sensory deprivation, know something about the recovery that the aesthetic life affords. Color plus sound, and the weight of the quilt, weight accrued by scraps passed from hand to hand and then folded over the body. So when Spillers writes that the African-American male has been touched, handed by the mother in ways that he cannot escape. She is in part asking, what she is in part asking for is an appreciation for how this handing not only makes Black gender monstrous, but also disarranges a sensorial economy in which Black hardness accrues value over time. Contemporary Black feminist scholars help us understand how the Black sensorium is shaped by both discourses of racial difference and the physical forms of coercion that buttress them. Petal Samuel, for example, beautiful new book called The Quiet Zone, shows us how the colonial sensorium naturalized quiet as a desired sensory state. Samuel shows us how people wield culture to unmask and antagonize colonial power. That is, to name sense perception as both a crucial domain of imperial governance and a domain where solidarities either forge or fracture, to reveal and refuse the sensory rhetorical conversion of the Caribbean region into a paradise, to grant space to Black feminist and queer and intimacy, and to make radical artistic claims that sonic intensity is valuable and pleasurable. Mecca Jamila Sullivan uses her own tuned sensitivity to help us think about the sensory costs of respectability, showing us, for example, how the protagonist of Toni K. Bambara's 1972 short story, The Lesson, has to learn the problem with presentability by feeling it in her body as she looks at her pedigreed teacher and thinks to herself, the starch in my pinafore is scratching the shit out of me, and I'm really hating this nappy head bitch and her goddamn college degree. Sullivan reads what she refers to as the Black girl sensorium, Black girl interiority, as a vital critical lens for navigating the impossible burden of representation, where the burden of representation actually distresses the body by scratching against it. Amber Musser's study of Black women's hair textures as textures of defensiveness shows us how Black women invest in naturalness as a bulwark against the encroachments of capitalism and white normativity, sustaining a fantasy that unstraightened hair signifies a different type of relationship to the state. L.H. Stallings begins her own theory of transaesthetics, the work of reading culture's multisensory affordances in ways that require a reorganization of the senses and sensorium by thinking against the limits of the scholarly form. If publishing and financial acumen allowed it, she says, this funky ass text would have been encased in a hardcover made of feathers, cotton or fur, and printed with embossed letters in deep purple or red on silk paper scented with jasmine, patchouli, Egyptian night, or some other incense real Black people love. It is tenderness we're after, isn't it? That tuned sensitivity that Barbara Christian was worried that theory, including feminist theory, was going to steal from us. Jennifer Nash describes it in this way: tenderness, the feeling of being sensitized, open to the world. She writes of Black feminist theory as an archive of tenderness. I want to think about what it means to attend to other people's bodies, she says, scrub their back, comb their hair, wash their hands, and to be made tender, raw even by that work. I endeavor to mobilize Black feminist theory to mark what it feels like to find oneself open, soft, receptive, vulnerable, broken open by love, by fatigue, by repetition, by devotion. Textures of recovery, the fur, the shag, the afro create wrinkles in the racial sensorium, allowing and enfolding and rewarding Black fragility in a world built on Black insensitivity. And these are folds that feminist theorists sheath ourselves into to change what happens at the level of meaning making and to cue a new set of internal rewards. But soft textures and other sensory affordances also aid recovery at the cellular level. So as my colleague, Lauren Whitehurst, and her colleagues teach us, North Americans spend the majority of our time in moderate threat states. So we all struggle to access the perception of safety that we need to enter what neuroscientists refer to as the deep rest states that redirect energy to health-promoting biological processes rather than survival. So processes such as cellular restoration at the mitochondrial scale. So expending energy on stress-related pathways of surviving and preparing comes at the expense of restorative and longevity-promoting cellular activities, Whitehurst and her colleagues suggest. And of course, access to perceived safety is distributed unequally and distributed sensorially. So certain smells, like the smell of urine, for example, more prevalent in working class or poor urban neighborhoods, or discordant sounds such as sirens increase the production of neuroendocrine factors that cue the body to produce protein and speed the heart rate, causing the body to spend more energy on surviving than on restoring or conserving. But counterscents, such as lavender, decrease stress-related physiological activity. And importantly for us, tactile props may activate specific sensory receptors and calm threat arousal, allowing for at least safety signaling, creating the perception of safety in an environment in which safety remains a racial entitlement, even when it doesn't correlate to race as predictably as it once did. So culture remains an important site of discursive recoding, of prompting a new science of forms of life, as Winter suggests. But expressive culture also cues us to the ways that a sensory recoding is a significant part of this new science too. Okay, last part, part 4, textures of recovery. So I want to use the questions we asked earlier. What are the wages we're paid to participate in domination? And where are those wages deposited? To bring us back to where we started, to that sheathed place where the Black neurodivergent protagonist of An Unkindness of Ghosts enlists the soft props to make sense of her own presence when wholeness, when repair, when return all recede as possibilities, and when she allows and even invites that receding. But I'm going to make one last move to help us think more about this. So I want to turn to Morrison's classic Black feminist novel, what my dear friend and collaborator referred to as perhaps Morrison's only Black feminist novel. She said it, Sula. A novel in the canon of feminist theory, Sula tells the story of a lifelong intimate friendship between Nell Wright, Nell Proper, Nell Upright, and Sula Peace of the outlaw Peace Women of Medallion, Ohio. The friendship offers these two girls safe harbor, something else to be in the context of racial segregation in the 1920s, and this is what we love about it. What pushed Barbara Smith to see it as the closest thing we had in 1975 to a Black lesbian novel, and inspired Rod Ferguson to analyze the novel's process of negation, in which an apparently non-political literary text about two Black women became a resource for epistemological and political practices that could express alternatives to existing social movements. But if we back away from the associations of the novel with a heroic narrative of Black lesbian becoming or sociality, we can see how its representation of the sensory soothing that is afforded by textures of recovery give us Black feminist theory not only as a liberatory discursive analytic that's about meaning making, but also as a theory of the sensorium under duress. What Nell Wright brings to her now legendary friendship with Sula Peace is segregation trauma that lives in her internal reward system. Early in the novel, when Nell is a girl, she travels south with her mother in a Jim Crow train. Maybe you remember. When they accidentally enter a white car and proceed through it to the colored only section, they're chastised by the white conductor. But worse than that, Nell's mother, Helene, obeys the conductor and smiles at him, indicating delight and perhaps sexual availability. Like a street pup that wags its tail at the very door jamb of the butcher shop he has been kicked away from only moments before, Morrison writes. And worse still, two Black soldiers watch the whole scene, looking stricken. Nell turns her eyes down, unable to take it all in, the judgment and the humiliation that is marked texturally. There in the fall of the heavy brown wool of her mother's coat. She held her eyes. She could not risk letting them travel upward for fear of seeing that the hooks and eyes in the placket of the dress had come undone and exposed the custard-colored skin underneath. She stared at the hem, wanting to believe its weight, but knowing that custard was all that it hid. And we learn that Nell is afraid that she too was, quote, really custard. Nell's primal scene happens in a place where gendered sensory overstimulation is already racially distributed. Black women posed a problem for gender segregated train cars, as there was only one car for Black people, and Black women did not have access to the ladies' car that white women occupied. So, as Mark Smith notes, by arguing that they should sit with Black men in the smoking car, a space filled with stench, replete with the visual evidence of tobacco chewing, a space endured only by the dullest of senses, whites made Black women sensorially something other than women. So the shame that emerges in this scene of forced overstimulation in Sula, an overstimulation that repeats the ungendering of the Middle Passage, leads Nell to use the soft prop of the wool dress to cope with what is actually disgust, prompted by her own gelatinous being. So the gelatinization, the skin turning to the color of custard and then to custard itself, becomes both a metaphor for failed agency and the untouchable material that mirrors it. As Keela Tompkins shows in her work on deviant matter, gelatinousness can seem uncannily human. Its molecular structure is non-Newtonian. So the viscosity of non-Newtonian substances, these are fluids that change depending on applied force. They can behave as solids under stress or as liquids when at rest. So Jello, for example, seems abject because it's strangely reactive and thus neither subject nor object. So Nell's shame, which is perhaps a shame over the lack of a hard edge, her non-Newtonianness, her non-uprightness, her non-rightness, is triggered when, as an adult, she discovers her friend, Sula, with her husband, Jude, quote, on all fours, like, go on, say it, like dogs. Upon the discovery of Jude's infidelity with her best friend, the novel shifts to the first person, a perspective from which we can sense with Nell the impact of trauma on sensory processing. In Nell's mind, she speaks to Jude. And only if you had not looked at me the way the soldiers did on the train, she says. Nell struggles here, as she did on the train, with proprioception, knowing where her own body ends, and with vestibular function, understanding where she is in space. She, quote, looked around for a place to be, a small place. The closet? No, too dark. The bathroom. It was both small and bright, and she wanted to be in a very small, very bright place. Once inside, she sank to the tile floor next to the toilet. On her knees, her hand on the cold rim of the bathtub, she waited for something to happen inside. Nell is resourcing herself with cold, hard things, working to find her edge. What happens inside, though, is outside. There was a stirring, a movement of mud and dead leaves. And Nell is transported back to another scene of trauma, the funeral of Chicken Little, the young boy she and Sula watched drown scenes earlier. Nell wants to grieve now, like the women at the funeral. She wants to, quote, feel something. And she waits for it, what Morrison calls her very own howl. What the howl would offer to Nell is a grief that might be owned, objectified, entombed, rather than lay in wait outside, randomized like leaves falling. But the howl doesn't come. Rather, it transforms into something or is replaced by something ugly and soft, a gray ball of fur. One of the most curious things to me about Sula, right? There was something just to the right of her in the air, just out of view. She could not see it, but she knew exactly what it looked like, a gray ball hovering just there to the right, quiet, gray, dirty, a ball of muddy strings, but without weight, fluffy, but terrible in its malevolence. The ball of fur is always there, just out of sight, and now lives until the end of the novel, afraid to turn her head. What is soft is horror. In Sula, what is soft destabilizes the boundaries of selfhood. It endangers the sensory processing work of restoring proprioception and vestibular function. So Nell walks through life like that, off kilter and dysregulated. But the scene of failed reconciliation at the end of the novel enlists the soft prop to make sense of presence when repair is impossible. And this is significant as it signals a recoding of Nail's pain/reward system. Visiting Sula's deathbed, Nell, quote, picked at the fringe on Sula's bedspread and said softly, "We were friends." And before those cathartic last lines, "we was girls together," Morrison returns to that other softness, the softness outside, leaves stirred, mud shifted. There was the smell of overripe green things. A soft ball of fur broke and scattered like dandelion spores in the breeze. The bedspread that Nell fingers affords an edge that is not hard, an edge that gives, an edge that, in the absence of repair, cradles the fragility of, and maybe the fragility as, something else to be. The bedspread cooperates, that is, in producing the Morrisonian something else to be. Nell's picking at Sula's bedspread is just like what happens at the end of An Unkindness of Ghosts, a non-reproductive coupling that uses the soft object to process, to regulate, to reprogram the sensorium, and to expand what gender can do when repair is not an option. Which is not that different from Baby Suggs, who even after watching her daughter do the unthinkable, after actually finding herself at the end of the world, makes an occasional request for color. On first read, we might think Baby Suggs gives in to despair when she finally announces to Setha and Denver that there's no bad luck in the world but white people, or they don't know when to stop. But before Baby Suggs leaves her daughter and granddaughter to hold that thought, Morrison says, she pulled up the quilt. And this, something like compression therapy, gives her a soft edge for handling her own fragility. It is one small offering to herself of color and texture, one final moment of sensory soothing, which is not that different from Hurston's Janie Crawford, quote, pulling in her horizon like a great fishnet, pulling it from around the waist of the world and draping it over her shoulder. So with all of this in mind, I return one more time to An Unkindness of Ghosts, where we began. When the earth softens enough to become a sheath for the novel's protagonist, a protagonist with nothing left, no one left to defend, but nevertheless has become the blade in the sheath, we are left with the question, does one need to be hard in order to be sharp? If softness is not just vulnerability or care or the refusal of hardness, but is also a regulatory environment, that is an environmental condition that recalibrates the nervous system, then we can understand the textures that offer recovery through modalities like compression and pressure as props through which our bodies remain inhabitable even now. Thank you for your attention.